Welcome to episode 15 now of the Creative Train podcast. In this episode, I'm going to dig into something that I get really fired up about, and that is teaching style. Now, you may be listening to this and saying, well, I'm not a teacher. How is this going to apply to me? One of the things I always like to tell people is that the best way to understand something is to imagine that you're teaching it. Did you enjoy learning every lesson along the way? Are there other ways you think you could have learned them better? Let's talk about that. All aboard? So this one's going to run a little longer than the other ones because, like I said, I get fired up about this stuff. So as a music teacher, I've experienced countless assumptions about what music lessons entail, what they're about, and how they can be, or should be conducted. And this stems from a lot of places. I try to reconcile these assumptions in my mind all the time. And over my 30-some years of teaching experience now, I've come to some pretty solid conclusions about how to help the student reconcile their own assumptions and reset their goals and aspirations, if necessary, around a new perspective on learning. The thing with music and music learning is that there are plenty of highly skilled players and composers out there who did not have the luxury of formal lessons in their early years. There are plenty of amazing players who can't read music, or if they can, it's a very slow process. And there are those who don't really understand music theory, but can still play and compose in all keys and transpose and jam out with the best of them. And all of these highly valued and seemingly lofty skills are attained and made useful without being taught how to do them. How does this happen? And what is the secret? And then in contrast to this type of musician is the highly trained, formally educated musician who can sight read completely new music with the greatest of ease, knows the name given to every type of chord and melody pattern or cadence, can play from memory the works of the masters, and can explain it all as if reading from a textbook. So which musician is better? Which musician is more successful? Which musician enjoys their art and craft more? And which musician has more fun? If I'm being truthful, I would say that it would likely be a virtual dead heat between the two. There are people who require all the information and the details in their learning process, the nomenclature, the definitions, all of that. And there are those who instinctively reject those same things, but they both end up fairly satisfied and capable, just at slightly different things. To contrast these two, I'll use the examples of the skills I mentioned earlier. Not having formal lessons can make the journey a little bit longer, a little bit tougher, and at times kind of confusing, to be honest. Whereas the student enrolled in lessons has a teacher or mentor by their side to ask these questions to, or to give them the information if they didn't ask, and they can seek clarification or redefinition and be shown proper techniques along the way. But after a few years of dedicated practice, both will generally end up in the same place ability-wise. And I've seen this a lot where a self-educated student comes to me for formal lessons in an earnest quest to clarify things they've heard about or wondered about, and they have a really solid and capable skill set already in place. They just need some explanation as to the why of these things and how they work. And it's cool because sometimes giving them just a slight nudge in a certain direction unlocks huge waves of discovery when they come to understand the basic systems that are at work in music. These are not only theoretical systems, but technical ones as well. For the student who had all these things explained and demonstrated from the start of their musical journey, they'll sometimes not really understand the value of knowing these things. They just see them as part of the process, do their work, and again, might not understand the real-world use for these studies in a practical, working musician's kind of way. The student who has either come upon these things on their own or was shown or saw something in a video online has to be really sharp in that moment to not only pick up the moves and the sounds, but also to be able to ground it into their skill set without the necessary verbiage or explanation to define it. What I mean by this is that new things can seem random if you don't first understand the source of the pattern. And how this plays out in music, on guitar, for example, is that there are many ways to play every single chord or scale, but the modern tradition for learning guitar is a visual first approach. Not everybody starts off learning the guitar reading music at the same time. In fact, I don't encourage that. I never have and I never will. So learning what a certain pattern looks like or sounds like and how to play it repeatedly can be done without knowing a single note name. And this is all fine at the beginning, but given that there are many ways to play the identical pattern on a guitar, when a student sees a new pattern that they haven't played before, they have no real grounding place for it because the appearance of the shape of the fingering pattern is unfamiliar. And they might not even realize that they're playing something completely common and known to them, but just in a different manner. I've seen it countless times when, once given a definition of the pattern, like major or minor scale intervals, the student's face will show the processing going on to understand, to reconcile that sound with the name. And then they'll say something like, "Oh, yeah, I've heard that before, but I played it this way." And at that point, the connection is firmly made between the sound and the theoretical definition of it. They smile, and maybe we share a laugh, and I can actually see a change in the whole person from facial expression to posture, like they've been made just a little bit more buoyant by that experience. Their mind was hungry for the information, and that seed of information found fertile ground to grow in. So as long as the person in question knows the facts, does it really matter how they learned them? Nope, not in the slightest. What matters is that you know what you're doing when you're playing, and you know it well enough that you can change and adapt it if necessary. So here I want to go off script just for a little bit and give an interesting to me, funny story about my own learning process in music. Now remember, this can apply to all kinds of other situations. Mine just happens to be with music. So when I was first determining that I wanted to be a professional musician, this was probably back in grade 10, I didn't read music at all. I knew some of my notes, but I didn't read at all. And I knew that there wasn't an option for kids in post-secondary study for, the ones that don't read music. But I could play. And I had been playing for many, many years, semi-professionally, I guess you could say, since the time I was 14. I've been playing in bands and bars. One of my first real inspirations, as I was playing bass at the time, was a fellow named Jaco Pastorius. And if you know the name, you'll know why I found him particularly fascinating. So it became my life's mission to learn how to play like Jaco. I didn't want to be like him. It's a pretty tragic story. And there was a few riffs that he would do, and I would always struggle with trying to figure out how he was doing it. Because remember, I didn't know the scales. I didn't know what playing in a certain key actually meant. And so what I would do is I would try and just wiggle my fingers around until I got close to the sound. And often I would be able to get the songs, but this one riff just kept eluding me. I actually bought his study book and VHS videotape course and started learning how to read from that, because that was going to be how I was going to learn how to read well enough, I thought, to get me into college. One of the things that really was such a lightning rod moment for me was hearing him talking about how there's so many different ways to play the same thing. And I didn't quite understand that, but I knew that there were duplicate notes in different places where the actual same pitch of the note can be played in another place. So I was going through one of the studies, and there was this little a chromatic thing. In music terms, chromatic means moves in half steps. It's just very small increments of notes. And what it was doing, if you're of the musical mind, he was going chromatically just from the second to the third note of the scale. So if we're talking like C, we're going D, D sharp, E, and then he was hitting the G on top of that. Bow, bow. And it was a riff that always defied me because I couldn't play it in time properly with all the other things that were going on around it. And then one morning, I was playing my bass before school, practicing this riff, and I just couldn't get it. And I remembered the thing in the video where he was saying that you can play all these things so many different ways. And instead of thinking about the finger pattern that I was to play, I thought about the names of the notes. And when I found another position to play that in, the whole game changed for me. All of the things that I found were difficult before because I had only learned one way to do something were suddenly becoming way easier, and I was nailing the parts. The example of the song is Joni Mitchell's Free Man in Paris from the live album that she did with Jocko in the band. Pat Metheny was in there, Don Elias. What a stacked band. Check it out. It's called Shadows and Light. That's the name of the album. So, getting back to the script now. All this goes into the music reading part of things, and it matters nothing at all how you learned your notes, only that you know what they are and you understand the proper naming of them through different keys because somebody's going to try and catch you on it at some point. This is not supposed to be a music lesson here, but in other trades, you might say, all that matters is that you know your ingredients, how to use them, how to change and adapt them, or how to expand your palette and be creative with them. On the topic of technique, it can be really fascinating to watch a self-taught person at work because they will have wrestled with acquiring the skill to do a certain thing without ever having been shown the likely most efficient way of doing it by their instructor or mentor or peers. So in the struggle to do all these things, they come up with some really non-traditional but very effective and inventive ways to do things like strum chords, play solos, or paint a wall, refinish a piece of furniture, repair a small engine, or create an amazing pasta sauce. And again, it doesn't matter at all how they learn to do these things, only that they actually know how to do them. So if we use a food analogy, some finishing details might be different between the formally educated chef versus the self-taught chef. But like I always tell my music students, nobody's going to know how you learned these things. You just have to learn them. My job is to make the material understandable and digestible, and you will remember it in your own way. There was a funny Venn diagram I saw once on social media about how musicians learn new material. And the smallest part was called dedicated study. And the largest part was called while performing on stage. And I can totally relate to this. I've been there, and you likely have been there too. If you find yourself in some kind of professional or social situation and you have to immediately improvise to solve a problem or achieve some kind of resolution or result. In a working musician's context, this might look like somebody in the crowd shouts out a request for a song, but only one band member actually knows it. And they turn around to this band and they say, it's okay, it's kind of like a blues in G, but there's a weird turnaround after the second chorus. And we look at each other, we nod, we smile, we take a deep breath, and we wait for the downbeat to start the song that nobody knows how to play but one of us. And if you're lucky enough to be working with skilled enough musicians, this is one of the biggest rushes you can experience. You're on the giddy edge of panic for effing up in front of an audience, but you're still playing it, and it's super exciting to ride that knife edge of either falling flat or exceeding your own expectations. One of the most amazing things that happens in that moment is how your brain goes into a slightly panicked mode. When you're in that mode, you become super alert, super sensitive, and the information that you're processing in real time, like holding the right groove, playing the right notes, anticipating that odd change after the second chorus, that grounds that moment into your memory like nothing else ever could. Not sitting alone in your room with mindless repetitions on reading sheet music, not following a chord chart in real time, not talking about the song, but actually playing it live and having to then remember it for the duration of the song for when the repeats come up. All this in real time. What a rush that is. And I suppose that might be the same kind of feeling for those people who do improv theater. All of their skills, chops, their go-to lines are pressed into action, and they have to be at the ready as if rehearsed, but they're not. Or maybe as a chef in a busy kitchen, when suddenly an order comes in from a VIP customer and something you don't even have on the menu that night is requested, and suddenly you have to slam yourself into super chef mode, and everyone better stay out of your way as you kick into gear and create that dish from memory, given only what is at hand and what can be immediately accessed. In a rush, you panic, you channel all of your skills and experience and get that dish prepared and sent out in record time. The edge of panic moment can be found in every job, every creative endeavor, and even something as mundane as driving your car. When suddenly an animal darts out in front of you, or someone does something stupid like trying to pass going up a hill. And so your savoir-faire becomes the determining factor in that perceived success or failure of the project, whatever it might be. The quickness of your adaptability, the accuracy of your assessments, and the execution of your determination, all of it is a result of your time spent learning your craft. Whatever your position is, when pressed, how you respond is a direct showing of how well you learned your lessons and how deeply that information is ingrained in you. Back to the top with my original comment about teaching style. But you haven't actually mentioned a particular teaching style yet, you might say. Oh, well, not directly, but I have, actually. If you found yourself relating to any of these situations or anecdotes, you've also remembered how you learned your skills, your lessons, and techniques. Whether they were on your own in the flight of improvising with new things, or you were guided by an experienced hand in a workshop or class setting. Was it an easeful journey or one along the proverbial road of hard knocks? All of this brings me to the main seed of inspiration for this episode. And that was a phrase that I thought of and immediately wrote down into my podcast script ideas folder in the notes section on my phone. And the phrase is teachers that encourage individuality versus conformity. Again, back to music teaching because it's my strongest example. The traditions for learning music are many. On your own, in a class, one-on-one. And now with the advent of thousands of often dubious online method subscriptions, your choices are virtually endless for finding inspiration and information. So you, as the eager student, go in search of these things, but you're going to have to filter through a lot of virtually endless sources. As an instructor, when you're putting together these things, your lesson plans, you have to remember to be flexible and adaptable. You will have your own means for explanation and delivery, but rest assured, you do not have a secret method that nobody knows about. So if you've been tempted to roll out that line in an ad, just don't. You cannot earn trust and fidelity from your clients by lying to them, because every one of them will figure you out eventually. I had the pleasure, I had the responsibility of working with a recent university graduate from a music school in what I felt like a bit of an unofficial mentorship as she came aboard to teach at one of the studios I work out of. She was armed with reams of memorized information, could tell you every piece she had ever learned, and name-dropped every instructor she had ever worked with. And you know how I feel about name-dropping. And she was pretty constant about reminding most people about most of these things. And she even had an iPad with sheet music on it. Sometimes we'd talk about teaching methods, the water cooler kind of talk. And I would describe some of my methods, dealing with certain students as of the moment. Meaning that my job is to help my students by giving them pertinent and timely information, regardless of what they want to study. If you don't want to read, we still study notes. If they want to play Metallica on the ukulele, we'll do that too. But I will never insist that there is one particular thing that they need to do. Her comment to that was kind of funny. She said she's always by the book, and there are only 2 book series that she has ever found that are good enough and that she will use. She's 22 years old, I think. And it's one of those 2 series that you will use with her, or you'll have to find another teacher. I commented something like, wow, that's kind of harsh. And she said it's exactly what worked for her and made her disciplined enough to graduate university. And I asked her, I said, that's great, but did you enjoy any of it? And she laughed and she said, of course not. She was not open to helping her students learn their own material that they were inspired by or wanted to learn. It was by the book, one of the 2 books, or nothing at all. And to me, that's sad. But this is just another example of someone who can and will only teach in the same manner in which they were taught. Regardless of how uncomfortable or uninspiring it was, they're now charged with forcing other new beginners through that same colander of indoctrination. Recently, she moved on to open up her own private studio, which she said was funded by her parents, and actually told me she only wanted to teach here for a year to learn the ins and outs of the business. And now, after 1 year, she has it all under control and she's ready to move on. I congratulated her and wished her well, but I could not help but kind of shake my head at her, feeling like she had reached the apex of her teaching abilities, despite her insistence on only teaching from 1 of 2 method books. Well, to each their own, I suppose. But the role of being a teacher in any discipline really should be primarily to keep your students engaged and inspired and excited to learn, while delivering the information they need to not only understand the concepts, but also the process, the techniques, and how these things came to be the way they are now. The history, development, adaptations, revisions of whatever the thing is that you're teaching have to be a part of your delivery. It's our job as teachers to weave these things in and to be able to reinterpret or explain them in 50 different ways to 50 different students if necessary. So to draw this all to a close now, if you are the teacher, when preparing your lessons, think back to how you first learned what you know now. Was it engaging, inspiring, exciting? Or were you just there memorizing facts out of a book so you could eventually get your teacher's ticket? If you choose to only go by the book and only deal with lessons directly out of an established method or guidebook, try to understand that not every student will really get anything of value from that. Think of that teacher in the old Charlie Brown cartoons. Wah, 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 wah. You don't want to be that guy. You have to know your stuff well enough that you can teach it without any books at all. Yes, there are things like regulations for safety and standards codes related issues that have to be taught by the book and adhered to, but always try to put yourself in your students' positions and ask if your lessons are actually speaking to them, or are you just talking at them? Teach in the way you wish you had been taught. And you will not only deliver much more quality to your students, but also keep them more engaged and understanding that you are on a shared journey of learning and teaching with them. There's your pep talk. Now go get to work. See, I told you I can get kind of fired up about these things, but I think it's really important because we're all here to learn something. And when you're trying to learn something, imagine new ways to explain it. Because even if you're not a teacher, the best way to learn something is to try and teach it. It shows your perspicacity, your understanding, your adaptability. Yeah, we ran a little long with that one, but I think it was an important topic to deal with.